Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Halion 7 tutorial series. In the last episode, we had a look at LFOs, which are all about cyclic, repeating changes of state modulation that we apply to the synthesizer. It could be to pitch or volume or filter. In today's episode, we're going to have a look at envelopes, which are primarily concerned with a one-way journey through a series of modulation states that take us from a beginning, called an attack, through a middle, called decay, to an end, called a release. But really they're doing the same job. But as you'll see today, the distinction between LFOs and envelopes can be blurred to almost meaninglessness. That doesn't mean that there isn't value in treating them differently, because ordinarily an envelope does a specific job, ordinarily an LFO does a different job. And maintaining the distinction between those two things is really useful, and it's why we do it. If you're enjoying this series and you'd like to help support my channel, check out the Patreon and channel member links below. It's an awesome way to do it. We're going to start off today with the analog brass pad preset, which is from the Halion Sonic SE Basic library, so you should all have access to it. I don't think every episode has to use sawtooths and sine waves all of the time. We've just got a slightly nicer sound to play with, but it's still very, very simple indeed. And as you can see, I've locked open the envelope section. This is where we're going to be spending the majority of today. I'm going to make the envelope section slightly bigger. See this little dotted line? Just drag that down. So let's make a start. What you can see here is an ADSR envelope: attack, decay, sustain, and release. The attack phase of an envelope is always the first stage, exactly one stage. This line here, this slightly curved line, is the attack phase. Every time I press a note, it takes an amount of time to get from minimum volume, represented by the bottom of the graph, up to maximum volume. If I move that node further to the right, it's going to take longer and longer to get to maximum volume. As you can see, this attack phase has a complex shape. In fact, every stage of a Halion envelope can be made complex. If you simply pick up the line and drag it, you can change the logarithmic or exponential nature of that line. If I press the control button down on my keyboard and click the line, it'll reset it to a straight line, and then I can pick it up and deform it again. So if I make the line exponential and press a key, it takes longer to get to that stage where the volume is accelerating. You can also see each time I click on a node or hover over it, you get some tooltip information. So it's telling me that it's taking 1.1 seconds to reach maximum 100% level. Now if I press a quiet note and then a loud note, see the difference of speed between the journey that first node took. That's because we have velocity sensitivity on this envelope at the moment. Down below the graphical interface, the velocity sensitivity is controlled by this velocity into time function, and at 100 you have basically standard mapping across the 127 MIDI points of the velocity curve. If I double click that value and set it to 0, now every note that I play is going to take exactly the same amount of time to get to that pink dot. Quiet note, loud note. Now by default, only the attack phase is subject to this treatment, and that's because the segments selection box to the right of the time value is set to A, which stands for attack. But you can actually make this parameter apply to the entire envelope. I'm going to drop this selection box down and say all, and now watch this second line. Quiet note, loud note. So the entire envelope is now being subjected to that modulation. Whereas this time, a very quiet note. The second stage operates at the same speed as a very loud note. It goes very quickly through the attack phase and then slows down. Now there's a very big difference between the decay phase and the attack phase of a Halion envelope. The decay phase can contain many different stages. If I double click anywhere in this space, you can see that I'm going to create multiple different points. Now I just picked up that yellow box and moved it over to the right hand side in order to create some extra nodes. This yellow box is important. This is the sustain point. Everything in front of the sustain point is decay. So all of these nodes that I just created were decay. If I press a note now, you're going to hear this note get periodically louder and quieter as it travels through this complex decay envelope. Here we go. But if I hold it long enough, when I reach the sustain point, I'm going to stick there until I let the key go. Everything after the sustain point is called the release phase, and this is what happens after you let the key go. Now at the moment, the envelope's kind of disappearing off into infinity. You can drag the lower horizontal bar to zoom in or out, but what I very often like to do is just click this little A button, which basically means zoom into full vision, see all or everything. Now I can see the entire envelope. Now when I double click to the right of the yellow square, the sustain point, I'm now creating release nodes. It's going to be exactly the same effect, but this time describing what's going to happen after I've released the key. So press the key down, hold it down, there's my sustain point. Now I'm going to let go, and then we enter the release phase. So 512 nodes to play with in total, one attack phase, multiple decay and release phases, one sustain point. And what happens if I want to move this sustain node somewhere else? Let's say I want to set this node here to the sustain node instead. Very easy to do. Simply right click on the node and say set sustain node. The pink dot represents the currently selected node, and you see information over on the left hand side that describes that thing. So you can see this 109 milliseconds. That's the length of time, that's the amount of time that it takes to get through this stage here. That's stage number 5. So if I pick up that number and drag it up, now you can see stage number 5 getting longer. I can, of course, pick this node up and move it. Does the same job. We have quite a fine level of control over what we can do with this node. All I'm doing at the moment is clicking it with my mouse and dragging it around. If I press the Shift key and drag the node around, I move it with a very much finer level of granularity. I'm kind of drawing a circle with my mouse here, and you can see I'm not moving the node very far. I'm going to let go of the Shift key now and do exactly the same thing, and I'm moving it much more radically. If I press the Alt key down, I lock the horizontal state of the graph, and I can only move it up and down now. So that's easy if you want to change the volume but not the position in time. Just hold your Alt key down. If I want to move this node to the left and right but have no other effect on the rest of the envelope, I enter fixed mode. So I'm going to press this little blue box to enter fixed mode, and now when I pick this node up, you can see that I'm not having any other effect on the envelope, just the node that I'm working with. Fixed mode does more than that though. Treat it like the insert and overwrite options if you're writing a document. With fixed mode on, it's basically like you're in overwrite mode. To demonstrate this, I'm going to switch to one of the other editing features. I'm going to go into draw mode, which is the little pencil symbol. What's going to happen now is that an envelope stage, a brand new envelope stage using this shape, which is just a straight line, is going to be introduced into this envelope. I'm going to choose this point basically in between the two nodes here. I'm going to click, and you'll see that the new stage has been introduced. It's this horizontal line here, but the rest of the envelope has been left otherwise unaffected. Just undo that. I'll press Ctrl Z. So all operations in Halion you can control from your keyboard. That was a Ctrl Z operation there. What I'm going to do this time is come out of fixed mode and insert a new stage, but you'll see all of the nodes to the right get moved in order to accommodate this new stage. Here we go, single click. Now the entire envelope just got shifted over to the right, so it's like an insert operation. So the draw tool is really handy for introducing brand new stages. Now we can insert far more complex shapes than a simple linear stage. Let's drop our select options down, and you can see all of these different options to choose from. So let's pick something a little bit more complex. Again, a single click somewhere in the empty space of the envelope. And now this complex multi-node shape has been introduced. You can see that all of the nodes are also highlighted. So the primary node, basically the beginning of the selection zone, is pink, and all of the nodes after it are currently orange. If I switch back to edit, you can see that we have a multi-selection zone. This green box has been drawn around the envelope, and you can do an awful lot with this green box. Basically have all of these points around the outside by which you can manipulate this new section of the envelope. So I'm going to pick this section up that says compress and expand. And now if I drag up and down, you can see the node's basically being inverted if I drag it far enough. To the left and right we have tilt operations. And in the middle of the upper section of the box, we can compress and expand the entire envelope up and down. And then we've got nodes at the bottom for scaling in time. So this is the left-hand section, the right-hand section, and the middle, moving backwards and forwards. So there's an enormous amount of complexity that you can perform on this selection zone. You can change the number of nodes inside your selection zone. So at the moment, we've just got those 4. I'm going to press the Shift key down on my keyboard and select a new node. Now that's being added to the selection zone. Or I can draw a rectangle, a selection zone rectangle, and then all of the nodes inside that selection zone will be selected. So just an enormously complex and really rich editing. I mean, that alone is just really cool for kind of just have a bit of a play. Let's set the sustain point far off in the distance and see what that sounds like. Very nice. Now, in addition to being able to draw envelopes like this manually, you've also got a huge bank of entirely preset envelopes to choose from. We drop this little selection box down at the top right hand corner. You can see that this is how we throw all of the changes away that we've just made and get back to our standard default envelope. But in the filter and amp section, we've also got a load of stuff that's really convenient to use straight out of the box. So this is primarily a brass sound, so I can get pretty close to a simple ADSR envelope by selecting the brass ADSR. And now I'm back to basically the shape that I started with that sharp attack. Then after that initial hit of the attack phase, you have this sudden drop in your decay down to a static sustain level, and we'll hold there until we let the key go. Let's try another couple of these standard envelope shapes to get an idea what kind of things are available to us. Let's try a percussive ADSR. So now we have an instant attack. So you've lost a little bit of the natural feeling of a brass sound, but you've got that instant response from the keyboard. Then we can play with the release phase. So in this template, the release echoes template, we're going to get a multi-stage release, which is basically going to emulate something akin to a delay. Get those little delay pops. So it's only when we let the key go that we hear the release bounce, because this staggered part of the envelope is all after the sustain point. So here's our sustain point, and as soon as we let the key go, we actually jump up to the next node, so we get an increase in volume. There's me hitting the release, there's me hitting the sustain point at the lower level, and then as soon as I let the key go, we instantaneously jump up to get a kind of boost in volume in order to give us the release bounce. So we've seen the standard edit option, which is your arrow, and that's how you can pick up nodes and manipulate them as we've seen. If you click on the erase button, then you can simply delete nodes. If you use the selection box while you're in erase mode, it will select all of the nodes inside. So I'm just going to let the mouse go now. Both of those nodes were deleted. The paint option allows us to draw this shape repeatedly as we drag from left to right across the envelope window. So I'm just going to click in the bottom left hand corner with my mouse and start dragging, and you can see that it's creating multiple different shapes. Now it's going to follow this complex amplitude curve every time I press a key. So you can see that as I clicked up and down, I was basically describing that complex amplitude pattern where each one of those waves represents this is the modulation of the volume over time. It's really cool for creating kind of strobing effects. At the moment, all of this is freeform. All of those nodes aren't locked to the host tempo, but if I click this sync to host tempo, now we're in fractions of 111 BPM. And that'll follow the underlying tempo of the tune. Click A so that I can zoom out the entire envelope, and then change grid mode. If I change to 1/8, you can see that the horizontal grid's been updated to reflect this. Now everything that we've done so far has been in simple sustain mode. The envelope's been traveling once and sticking on the yellow box. If I pull my mode down to loop instead, now a new green line's appeared and it's a little bit mysterious. It's not quite so easy to see what's going on here. I'm just going to switch back to edit mode and zoom in a bit so that we can see this a little bit more clearly. I'm going to press a key and we'll see what happens and then figure out how to manipulate it. So it's traveling through the envelope and then it jumped right back to the beginning of the envelope and started again. It's going to carry on doing that over and over again. Now it's not easy to see what's going on at the moment because this attack node is currently set to 100%. If I pull that down, just drag it over a little bit, you can see that there's actually a second green line. These two green lines, if you pick them up and drag them, describe the beginning and the end of the loop phase of the envelope. This aspect of the interface is a little bit clunky. It's really not easy to see whether or not you're picking these loop nodes up. If I'm slightly off, you can see that now I'm drawing a selection rectangle, whereas if I click straight on the green line, then I do pick up the loop points. Now if I press a key now, you're going to get some slightly odd behavior. The envelope's going to play all the way up to the sustain point, then enter loop mode, and you'll see it jump back and then start looping around between these green lines. So here it's describing its standard envelope, gets all the way to the sustain point, jumps back to the loop start, gets to the loop end, and then cycles around between those two zones. So that's not a particularly intuitive way of using a loop. Typically, I would want my loop end to be at the same point as the sustain node. Now it's going to make a little bit more kind of musical sense. It's going to get to the sustain point and then just start jumping around inside this loop mode. So this is where envelopes and LFOs start kind of cross-pollinating, because this is really now taking on most of the attributes of a low frequency oscillator. It's doing this thing periodically. There's a second kind of periodic looping as well called shaper. Let's engage shaper and see what happens. Firstly, I'll just press a note. I'm going to get all the way to the end of the envelope and then immediately jump back to the beginning. Now the important thing about a shaper is that it always cycles around the entire envelope, so you haven't got those loop points anymore. The other important point to note is that we've lost our sustain node. There's no concept of sustain anymore. The entire envelope is the shape. If I pick up the end node, watch what happens to the beginning. So we're always completely sympathetic with our loop nodes. When we get to this point, we're going to jump around to the beginning, and it's always going to make sense because the start and end are intrinsically linked. But other than that, it's just going to basically do this and treat it as a very complex LFO. And because we're locked to the host tempo at the moment, everything is synced up. Just like with the LFOs we dealt with, the different kinds of sync modes, you can see that now I've entered shaper mode. I've got access to the same kind of, do I want to re-trigger off my key presses or off the host song position in the background, which is the beat option. These re-trigger modes carry on from the LFO as well. Do I want to trigger off just the first key note that I press or every single note that I press? So in this mode, see, I've only got one envelope. All of the notes are following it, but it's re-triggering every time I press a new note. The final mode to look at is one shot, and that's really straightforward. There's no sustain node, so I'm going to press a note, let it get halfway through, and then let the key go. The envelope carries on. It's always going to carry on right to the end. There is no concept of sustain or release. Every single time you press a note, it's going to do exactly this. So I'll just press one very quick note. It doesn't matter. I've let my key go now. My fingers aren't on the keyboard, but it's still playing the envelope. I've made so many changes to the underlying sound at this point. I'm just going to double click my preset to reload the original analog brass pad, get us back to the simple envelope. And you saw earlier how we can introduce velocity sensitivity through the velocity time function, but you also have keyboard mapping and time sensitivity, and that's accomplished with the controls on the right hand side of this lower row. And we have two different key follow settings, one for the main attack up to the sustain point, and one for all of the nodes after the release point. First demonstration I'm going to give is to introduce the time key follow up to about 60, And you can see that I've got a key center, which is currently D#3. Doesn't particularly matter what it is. What I'm going to do is play the lowest note on my keyboard and watch the speed of this envelope. Oh, I'm just going to set velocity sensitivity to 0 as well. Low note. Quite slow, sort of a stately progression through the envelope. I'm going to get to the sustain level. Now when I let the key go, you'll notice it's slightly faster. Okay, now I'm going to press the highest note on my keyboard. Get through that initial stage much faster, but now when I let the key go, it's going to release at the same speed that the low note did. So we've split the envelope up into pre-release and post-release, and each of those two different time zones are now keyboard sensitive. So every note on the keyboard is going to travel through the envelope at a different rate. But only up to the sustain node. Everything when I let the key go is controlled by the key follow for release. So let's introduce some of that as well. At the same value. So now all of the nodes of the envelope are going to follow the same pattern. Slow and stately, still slow and stately, let the key go, still slow and stately, and up at the top, everything is much faster. The idea between splitting these two nodes up is that when you stop playing the instrument, generally speaking, you want to kind of get out of the way as quickly as possible. So the release phase describes what happens when a person stops playing the instrument. The key center determines where that central point of the seesaw is, whether or not notes are slower or faster than a standard. And at the moment, D#3 is just somewhere in the middle of the keyboard. If you've got different musical instruments that have different tonal ranges, then set this to whatever that particular chromatic range is. Finally, you can superimpose a guide envelope underneath. I'm just going to reload the standard patch again so that you can follow along exactly what's going on here. I'm going to jump over to the filter envelope. You can see that the filter envelope is actually doing work. This is what's tailing away the upper frequencies as the envelope continues. We've got this quite long evolution. I'm just going to create some new nodes and then jump back over to my amplitude envelope and engage the guide. So I'm going to look at the filter in the background. You can see that the filter envelope's just been superimposed in the background. Now you can't see it all because they've got different zoom levels. So I'll click A, and now the filter envelope is taken into account. So the amplitude envelope has been squashed into this tiny little space. I'm going to make it a bit bigger. And then click and drag in the lower bar so that I can zoom into a single part of this envelope. And you can see that the filter envelope in the background is doing its thing. And the amplitude envelope over the top, we have an opportunity to sync these two things up. If I engage snap to guide envelope, and now pick this sustain point up, watch what happens when I get near that filter node in the background. You see it snaps to it. So this allows you to basically bring those two envelopes together so that the filter and the amplitude are performing sympathetic operations. If this was a sample-based sound, I would be able to load the sample waveform in the background so that I'd be able to see that superimposed envelope. We'll deal with that when we get to look at samples a little bit later in the series. Almost everything we've talked about today has been concerned with the amplitude envelope, but the filter and pitch envelopes are almost identical. The main difference between them is that the pitch envelope can also be bipolar. You get an extra button to enable bipolar mode. Basically just lets you go positive and negative. There's no concept of negative volume, so it doesn't make any sense in the context of amplitude. We also have a completely user-definable envelope that isn't currently mapped to anything, and that's just a new modulation source that we can use when we get onto a little bit more advanced editing later in the series. Hope you enjoyed this one today. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you again next time. Thanks very much.